Left with nothing after her husband's betrayal, Julia shocked everyone by arriving at her father-in-law's while reading. Rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield as Julia parked her aging sedan across the street from the grand mansion that had once felt like a second home. Her hands trembled as she turned off the engine, her chest heavy with the weight of years of hurt and betrayal. The Carmichael estate, with its towering marble columns and intricate iron gates, stood as a stark reminder of the life she'd been cruelly forced out of. Julia sat quietly for a moment, staring through the rain-streaked glass as she gathered her courage. She knew the people waiting inside thought of her as an outsider, an interloper who never truly belonged in their world. It had been 2 years since Eric had walked out of her life. She'd married him with dreams of a forever together. Eric had seemed like the perfect partner, charming, wealthy, and a member of one of the city's most influential families. For a while, she believed she'd found her fairy tale. But beneath his polished exterior was a man driven by ambition and selfishness. He craved status and power. And Julia, a modest schoolteacher from an ordinary background, was never enough for him or his family. When Eric blindsided her with the announcement that he was leaving her for a younger, glamorous socialite, Julia's world fell apart. He ensured she was left with nothing, forcing her out of their shared home with only her clothes and a battered suitcase. Later, she discovered that Eric and his family had collaborated to make sure she couldn't contest the divorce. Humiliated and penniless, Julia had no choice but to start over. Life after Eric was a daily struggle. She moved into a tiny studio apartment, taking on extra teaching jobs to make ends meet. Evenings were spent grading papers at a small kitchen table, often on an empty stomach because she couldn't afford a decent meal. Yet despite the hardships, Julia refused to crumble. The betrayal that had shattered her life had also hardened her resolve. She vowed to survive no matter what. And now, here she was, parked outside the Carmichael estate, questioning her decision to attend the reading of Richard Carmichael's will. She had only learned of her former father-in-law's passing a week earlier from a brief obituary in the newspaper. Richard had always been an enigma to her, stern, distant, and largely silent during family gatherings. He had never stepped in to address Eric's treatment of her, but Julia sometimes thought she saw a flicker of disapproval in his sharp eyes. The invitation to the will reading had come as a shock. Delivered to her shabby apartment by courier, the envelope was heavy and embossed with the unmistakable Carmichael family crest. Julia nearly threw it away, convinced it was some sort of cruel mistake. But curiosity got the better of her, and now here she was, bracing herself to walk into the lion's den. Before she could knock, the heavy door to the mansion swung open. The butler, a severe-looking man with years of service etched into his expression, stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Julia squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and stepped inside, ready to face whatever awaited her. The house smelled exactly the same: polished wood, expensive cologne, and the soft sweetness of freshly cut flowers. Walking through the grand entryway was disorienting, like stepping into a life that had once been hers, but now felt foreign. Memories threatened to overwhelm Julia: the laughter of holiday dinners, tense family arguments, whispered conversations, but she forced herself to stay focused as the butler silently led her to the study. When she entered, the room went dead silent. Every face turned toward her, the expressions a mix of shock, disdain, and barely concealed curiosity. Julia could feel the tension thick in the air, but she kept her composure, refusing to let her discomfort show. Near the window stood Eric, as smug and polished as ever, with his arm draped around Cassandra, his new wife. Cassandra's beauty was undeniable, her elegance carefully curated, but the sight of her sent a sharp pang through Julia's chest. She quickly shoved it aside. She had promised herself not to let Eric or anyone else see her pain. "What are you doing here?" Eric's voice cut through the silence like a blade, his tone sharp and incredulous as he stepped forward. Julia met his gaze without flinching. "I was invited," she said, holding up the envelope with the Carmichael family crest as proof. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. She refused to let him intimidate her. "You must be mistaken," Cassandra interjected, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is a private family matter." Before Julia could respond, the lawyer, a composed man with silver hair and an air of quiet authority, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carmichael," he said firmly, addressing Cassandra, "Julia is here because she is listed as a beneficiary in Mr. Richard Carmichael's will." Chaos erupted in an instant. Eric's face turned an alarming shade of red as he sputtered incoherent protests. Cassandra's expression froze, her jaw tightening as though she'd been slapped. The other relatives in the room exchanged furious whispers, their eyes darting between Julia and the lawyer. Julia stood still, her head held high. Inside, though, she was just as stunned as everyone else. "This is absurd," Eric shouted, turning toward the lawyer, his voice rising. "She has no right, no claim to anything in this family." "Your father disagreed," the lawyer replied coolly, unfazed by Eric's outburst. He calmly opened a thick, leather-bound folder and began to read. "Before his passing, Mr. Richard Carmichael made several amendments to his will," the lawyer explained. "These changes were made in private, without the influence of any family members. Julia Carmichael is listed as a direct beneficiary." Julia's mind raced, struggling to process what she was hearing. She had anticipated hostility when she walked into the room, sneers, maybe even a few cutting remarks, but this was beyond anything she had expected. Richard Carmichael had deliberately included her in his will.
Why?
The man had barely spoken to her in the years she was married to Eric. She could count their meaningful interactions on one hand. What could have motivated him to make such a bold move? As the lawyer continued reading, detailing the distribution of assets, it became clear that Julia's inclusion wasn't a minor footnote. Richard had left her something significant, something that Eric and his family clearly believed should have gone to them. The weight of the room's fury pressed against Julia, but she stood her ground, determined to find out exactly what her former father-in-law had done and why. The tension in the room reached a boiling point as Eric finally lost his composure. "This is outrageous," he shouted, slamming his hand on the polished mahogany table. "You can't seriously expect us to accept this." The lawyer, calm and unflinching, looked him squarely in the eye. "Mr. Carmichael," he said firmly, "your father's will is legally binding. If you wish to contest it, you're welcome to do so in court. However, I should warn you, your father was meticulous in his preparations. Any challenge is unlikely to succeed." Eric's face fell, the fury in his eyes dimming into visible frustration. For the first time in years, Julia felt a flicker of power, a small but meaningful victory over the man who had taken so much from her. Julia stayed silent, letting the lawyer's words linger in the heavy air. She didn't need to gloat or defend herself. The will was doing all the talking for her. As the reading continued, the atmosphere grew colder and more strained. Eric's rage simmered beneath the surface, his expression a mask of barely restrained fury, while Cassandra looked pale and ready to collapse. The other family members, clearly uncomfortable, avoided Julia's gaze entirely. One by one, they left the room, their whispers fading into the echo of footsteps down the marble hallway. When it was over, Julia stood alone in the study. Her hands trembled as she clutched the copy of the will the lawyer had handed her. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Stepping outside into the fading storm, Julia clung to the will like a lifeline. Though the rain had eased, a tempest churned within her. Questions swirled in her mind, refusing to be silenced. Why had Richard Carmichael included her in his will? Why leave her something so significant? She couldn't deny the satisfaction she felt at Eric's outrage. It was a long overdue moment of justice, but the mystery of Richard's intentions gnawed at her. As she climbed into her car, she glanced back at the mansion's towering silhouette. It no longer loomed over her with the same oppressive weight. Today, she had faced the family that had cast her out, and for the first time, she had stood her ground. Still, unease simmered beneath her resolve. Richard had been a distant figure during her marriage to Eric, polite but reserved, never offering much more than a formal greeting. What could have driven him to leave her something significant? Unable to resist the growing curiosity, Julia unfolded the will and scanned the clauses carefully. Her eyes froze on a specific section, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. To Julia Carmichael. I leave the Carmichael Vineyard estate and all associated assets. Julia's hands trembled as the weight of the inheritance sank in. The vineyard was the crown jewel of the Carmichael Empire, a sprawling estate renowned for producing some of the finest wines in the country. She had visited it only once, years ago, during a tense family holiday. Back then, Eric's relatives had treated her like hired help, assigning her menial tasks while they basked in luxury. The idea that she now owned the estate was almost incomprehensible. Yet there it was, in black and white, written in Richard's unmistakable hand. Her grip on the document tightened. The vineyard wasn't just a gift, it was a statement of vindication. Whatever Richard's reasons, he had chosen to give her the one thing Eric and his family likely coveted the most. And now, it was hers. A pang of unease accompanied Julia's realization. This inheritance wasn't just a windfall, it was monumental. Why had Richard Carmichael bypassed his own son, his flesh and blood, to leave such a legacy to her? Determined to uncover the truth, Julia decided to visit the vineyard. The lawyer had handed her the keys, along with the documents formally transferring ownership. Whatever the reason, the estate was hers now, and she needed to understand why. The next morning, Julia drove to the property, her modest sedan looking entirely out of place on the long, picturesque driveway lined with towering trees. On either side, rows of grapevines stretched into the misty horizon, the dew clinging to their leaves in the early morning light. At the center of the estate stood a grand stone house, weathered but timeless, exuding a quiet elegance. Workers moved steadily through the fields, their practiced movements speaking to years of experience. As Julia stepped out of her car, she was met by a man striding toward her. Tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face marked by years of hard labor under the sun, he regarded her with a cautious but kind expression. You must be Julia, he said, extending a calloused hand. I'm Henry, the vineyard manager. Mr. Carmichael spoke highly of you. Julia blinked, caught completely off guard. He spoke highly of me, she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Henry nodded, a faint smile softening his features. He didn't say much about his family, Henry admitted. But he always mentioned how you treated people with kindness, even when you didn't have to. He said you had a good heart, better than most of his family. A lump rose in Julia's throat. Richard had noticed her. She had spent years believing he barely acknowledged her presence, and yet, he had been paying attention all along. Henry motioned toward the house.
Come inside,
he said gently. There's something you should see. Inside, Henry led her to the study, a room lined with towering bookshelves and filled with the comforting scent of aged wood and leather. On the desk sat a small stack of letters, each one addressed to Julia in Richard's familiar handwriting. These arrived shortly before he passed, Henry explained. He asked me to hold on to them until now. Julia hesitated, staring at the stack of letters. The paper was thick and expensive, the envelope stamped with Richard's distinct initials. Finally, she picked up the first one, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, a reflection of his declining health. She began to read. Dear Julia, if you're reading this, it means I've passed, and you've been dragged back into the chaos of the Carmichael family. For that, I apologize. But I needed to ensure you were taken care of. You're probably wondering why I left the vineyard to you. The truth is, I admired you far more than I ever let on. You were kind, patient, and loyal in ways my son never deserved. When Eric betrayed you, it broke something in me. I saw too much of myself in him, selfish, arrogant, and blind to what truly matters. The vineyard was always meant to be a legacy of integrity and hard work. I couldn't trust Eric to honor that. But you have the strength and character to make it thrive. I hope this gift brings you the stability and peace you deserve. Sincerely, Richard Michel. Tears blurred Julia's vision as she set the letter down. Richard's words carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. He had seen her, truly seen her, even during the years she felt invisible and dismissed. The inheritance wasn't just financial security. It was validation of her worth, of the strength she had fought to maintain in the face of rejection and betrayal. She picked up the next letter, then the next, reading them all in the quiet of the study. Each one revealed more of Richard's thoughts, his regrets as a father, his disappointment in Eric's choices, and his hopes that Julia would find happiness and purpose again. By the time she finished, Julia felt overwhelmed by a bittersweet mixture of gratitude and sadness. Richard Carmichael had given her more than an estate. He had given her a second chance to build something meaningful, a legacy not just of land and vines but of trust, hope, and resilience. Word of Julia's inheritance spread quickly, and it wasn't long before Eric arrived at the vineyard. He showed up unannounced, barging into the house with the same entitlement he had always carried, as if the property still belonged to him. Julia was in the study, sorting through more of Richard's papers, when she heard his angry voice echoing down the hall. "This is ridiculous." Eric stormed into the room, his face flushed with indignation. "That vineyard belongs to me," he snapped. "My father had no right to." "He had every right," Julia interrupted, her voice steady and firm. She rose from her chair, meeting his glare with unflinching resolve. "And he made his wishes perfectly clear. The vineyard is mine." Eric scoffed, his expression a mixture of disbelief and scorn. "You can't seriously think you can manage a place like this," he sneered. "You're a schoolteacher, Julia. Sell it to me and save yourself the embarrassment." Julia crossed her arms, her jaw tightening as she stood her ground. "I'm not selling," she said coldly. "And if you think you can bully me into changing my mind, you're wasting your time." Eric's frustration boiled over, his tone growing sharper. "Don't be stupid, Julia. You have no idea what you're doing. This place will fall apart under your watch." "That's not your concern," Julia shot back, her voice unwavering. "Your father trusted me with this vineyard, and I intend to honor that trust. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Eric opened his mouth to argue further, but Julia held up her hand, silencing him. "Leave," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Or I'll have you escorted off the property." For a moment, it looked as though Eric might explode with rage. But after a tense pause, he spun on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Julia listened as his car roared down the driveway, and when the sound finally faded, she sank back into the chair. Her heart was pounding, but she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. She had stood up to Eric, something she never thought she'd be able to do. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. Later that evening, Julia stood on the balcony of the vineyard's main house, gazing out at the rolling hills bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. The vineyard was alive with activity, workers carefully harvesting the grapes, trucks rumbling along the dirt paths, and the rhythmic hum of progress filling the air. For the first time in years, Julia felt a profound sense of belonging. Richard's letters had given her clarity and purpose, but the real work was just beginning. Managing the vineyard wasn't easy. Julia threw herself into the challenge, determined to make it thrive. She studied Richard's meticulously kept records, spent hours in the fields with Henry, and absorbed every piece of advice she could from the workers. At first, the workers were wary of her leadership, skeptical that someone with no background in winemaking could handle the job. But Julia treated them with respect, asking questions and listening to their insights. Over time, their skepticism gave way to trust. With each passing day, Julia grew more confident. The vineyard was no longer just a piece of inherited property. It was her chance to create something lasting, something meaningful. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. But Eric wasn't ready to give up. 2 weeks after his dramatic confrontation at the vineyard, Julia received a court summons. Eric was contesting the will. His arguments were predictable but infuriating. Richard had been manipulated. Julia wasn't capable of managing the vineyard, and the estate rightfully belonged to him. The first court hearing was a spectacle. Eric arrived flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys, his confidence oozing as though the outcome were already decided in his favor. By contrast, Julia had only one attorney, a seasoned professional named Walter, whom Richard had personally recommended in his letters. Walter, with his calm demeanor and sharp intellect, was a stark contrast to Eric's aggressive legal team. Every word he spoke was measured, and his decades of experience showed in his methodical approach. Eric's lawyers wasted no time in launching their attack. They argued that Richard's amendments to the will were uncharacteristic, implying that Julia had unduly influenced him. They paraded a string of witnesses, distant relatives, and former employees, who tried to paint Julia as a manipulative gold digger, undeserving of the inheritance. Julia sat quietly through it all, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The accusations felt like echoes of her marriage to Eric, the same disdain and unfair judgments from people who barely knew her. But she refused to break. When Walter finally rose to speak, the energy in the courtroom shifted. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm and steady, "the plaintiff's case is built on conjecture, unsupported claims, and an attempt to malign my client's character. But what truly matters here are the clear and deliberate intentions of the late Mr. Carmichael, as evidenced by these letters." Walter handed the judge a thick folder of Richard's handwritten letters to Julia. As the judge read through them, the courtroom grew silent. The letters provided undeniable proof of Richard's thoughtfulness and intention. They spoke of his admiration for Julia, his disappointment in Eric, and his unwavering decision to entrust the vineyard to someone he believed would honor its legacy. One by one, Eric's arguments unraveled. In his final remarks, Walter delivered a decisive blow. "Mr. Carmichael did not leave this vineyard to my client on a whim," Walter stated, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "He chose her because she embodies the values he cherished: kindness, resilience, and integrity, qualities that, I dare say, are glaringly absent in the plaintiff." Eric's face turned bright red, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the truth. When the judge delivered the ruling, it was clear and firm. The will was upheld, and Julia's inheritance was secured. Eric stormed out of the courtroom, his threats echoing down the hallway. But Julia didn't care. She had won. Months passed, and Julia threw herself into managing the vineyard. Under her leadership, the estate began to thrive in ways even Richard might not have imagined. With Henry's guidance, Julia introduced sustainable farming practices that not only improved the quality of the wine but also positioned the vineyard as an industry innovator. She expanded the vineyard's distribution network, forging partnerships with boutique wine sellers and earning recognition for her forward-thinking approach. Word of her success spread, and Julia's reputation as a savvy and compassionate businesswoman grew. The vineyard was no longer just an inheritance. It was a reflection of Julia's resilience and hard work. For the first time, she felt truly at peace, knowing she had turned what began as a painful chapter into a story of triumph. One day, as Julia strolled through the vineyard, savoring the golden sunlight filtering through the grapevines, her phone buzzed unexpectedly. A reporter from a prominent lifestyle magazine was on the other end, requesting an interview. News of her court victory and the vineyard's remarkable turnaround had spread far and wide, capturing public fascination. At first, Julia hesitated. She wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. But after some thought, she agreed. It was an opportunity to share not just her journey, but the values she had worked so hard to uphold. A month later, the feature was published. Accompanying the article was a striking photo of Julia standing proudly among the lush grapevines. The headline read, "From Betrayal to Triumph, How One Woman Turned Heartbreak into a Thriving Legacy." The article chronicled Julia's story, from being abandoned by Eric to inheriting the vineyard and transforming it into a flourishing enterprise. Excerpts from Richard's heartfelt letters were included, offering readers a glimpse into his respect and admiration for Julia's character. The story resonated deeply with readers, inspiring countless messages of support and admiration. Julia's strength and resilience became a beacon for those who had faced similar challenges. Eric, however, was livid. The article painted him as the villain of the story, a role he couldn't refute. Public ridicule followed, and Cassandra, his glamorous second wife, soon left him, taking what little remained of his dwindling wealth. Julia couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. One quiet evening, as she sat on the porch of the vineyard's main house, watching the sunset paint the rolling hills in shades of orange and gold, something caught her eye. Tucked inside one of Richard's old journals was an envelope she hadn't noticed before. Her hands trembled as she opened it, unfolding the familiar paper and reading the letter inside. Dear Julia, if you're reading this, it means you've embraced the vineyard and made it your own. I have no doubt you face challenges, but I hope you've also found joy and fulfillment. You deserved better than what my son gave you, and I regret not stepping in sooner. But you've proven something to me. Strength isn't loud or aggressive. It's quiet and steady, like the roots of these vines. I hope this place becomes a sanctuary for you, as it was for me. And remember, Julia, the vineyard's success isn't measured in profits or awards. It's measured in the lives it touches, the workers, the community, and the people who drink its wine. Keep that in your heart always. Sincerely, Richard. Tears streamed down Julia's face as she folded the letter carefully. Richard's words were more than a reflection of his faith in her. They were a gift, a reminder that the vineyard was more than a business. It was a legacy built on integrity, resilience, and the power of connection. Years later, the vineyard had grown into a vibrant hub of activity and community. One of its most beloved traditions was the annual Harvest Festival, an event Julia had introduced to celebrate the vineyard's bounty and the people who made it all possible. On a crisp autumn day, families wandered through the fields, sipping wine, sampling fresh produce, and enjoying the music and laughter that filled the estate. Julia moved through the crowd, greeting guests, her heart swelling with pride at the joy that radiated from the land. At one point, she paused near the edge of the vineyard, where a plaque had been installed in Richard's memory. It read, "In memory of Richard Carmichael, a legacy of integrity and resilience." Julia smiled softly, tracing the words with her fingertips. The vineyard had become more than just a successful business. It was a living testament to kindness, perseverance, and the quiet strength that Richard had seen in her from the beginning. Standing there, surrounded by the vineyard's beauty and the community it now supported, Julia felt a deep sense of peace. She had transformed her pain into purpose and carried forward a legacy that would endure for generations.